Professor Bert Willems with us. He is going to present his paper on the topic of the regulatory holidays and optimal network expansion. Let me briefly introduce a little bit about Professor Willems. He affiliated with the Tilburg University, which is our exchange partner as well for the BE program. And also he affiliated with the Toulouse School of Economics. And he also published in several referee journals, for example, Journal of Economic Theory, International Journal of Industrial Organization, Journal of Industrial Economics, and also Energy Economics, and so on. We will spend about 40 minutes for Professor Willems to talk and discuss. And he preferred that if you have questions during his presentation, just raise your hand and he can respond right away. And after his presentation, he will give us the introduction about the Master and PhD program at Tilburg University, one of the leading universities in Europe. Now the floor is yours. Thank you.
So I'm not really used to speaking in a microphone, but so what I would like to do is to present a paper which is joint work with Gijsbert. And Gijsbert, he used to be working at Tilburg University, but he moved to the University of Groningen. And he has a background, he's a PhD in physics, so all the sort of stochastic programming part, that's mainly due to him, because he's really an expert in that. So the topic is actually about optimal network regulation. So I'm interested in energy economics, and I look at energy economics as more like from the industrial organization side, regulation, game theory. So that's sort of a mixture of IO, industrial organization, and energy economics, a bit of law and economics as well. And I have an engineering background, so I had some. That's how I went into energy economics. So what's the motivation of the paper? And the motivation of the paper is actually that we need continuous upgrades in networks. I don't know about the situation here in Thailand, but I assume that you're also expanding a lot in infrastructure. And this is also something that we see in Europe, that we need to expand the transmission networks. So if you think about energy networks, the electricity networks, the electricity grid needs to be extended a lot. And there are some different drivers for that. So the first is that we are shifting from classical fuels that are sort of polluting, that emit CO2. We are going to switch to renewable energy. So we're going to have wind energy, solar energy. And often those locations of the wind, they're going to be farther away from the demand sites. So it could be that we're going to build offshore wind farms in the North Sea, or we're going to build them somewhere in Norway along the coast. But that's not the place where people are actually living, so we need to transport electricity from the location where it's being produced to the location where it's being consumed. And the same with hydro. We have a lot of hydro, let's say in Switzerland, so we can store energy by pumping up electricity, or we can do that in Norway. So we maybe want to have some storage in the system. But in order to store energy in Switzerland, we need to have good connectors between the Netherlands and between Switzerland. I don't know if you know the Netherlands, but the Netherlands is quite flat, so we don't really have mountains. So if we want to store electricity by pumping up water, we have to find a location where we can do that. What we also see is that there's demand growth for electricity, and it's expected to grow more, because if we go to a low carbon economy, then lots of the fuels that we're going to use, let's say for heating, might be being replaced with electricity heating. So we might go to heat pumps. I don't know if you have heard, okay, I guess it's basically air conditionings that you can turn around to produce heat. I mean, the Netherlands is a bit colder than here, so we need to heat houses instead of cooling them down. But this means that we have a switch from fuel or from gas heating to electrical heating, and this means that the demand for electricity is going to increase. It also means that we need more transmission networks. And the third issue is that we have a lot of localized production, so people might put some photovoltaics on their roofs, they might want to drive electrical cars. And not everybody can charge the cars at the same moment in time in the street. Because otherwise you would have to have a big transmission distribution network to do the optimal that different people are going to charge their car at different moments in time. And for that you need smart distribution networks. So basically your car needs to be able to communicate with the distribution network. Maybe one house needs to talk to the next house because maybe they have a boiler to store hot water, but you want to store the hot water when electricity prices are low. So there's also an upgrade in sort of the sophistication and sort of the how much technology that's present in those networks. Yeah, so we need a lot of IT services there. So the estimates are that we need about 0.3% of GDP that needs to be invested in order to each year in order to upgrade those networks. We also see in other types of infrastructure industries that we need a lot of upgrades in infrastructure. So let's say in telecommunication, you basically see a continuous upgrade from different types of technologies, and those companies they keep on investing in new technologies. Yeah, so this is sort of the setting. So we need more investments, and we can now look at the regulatory framework. And in the energy market, what has been happening in Europe is that we have liberalized the energy market. So basically, we have. So I just discussed, so I could explain a little bit more also about the European situation. So is this the right one? No, just okay. So we have, let's say, the value chain. So you have generation. Then you have, let's say, electricity sector. You have transport. You have distribution, retail, and then you have the final end users, so you have the consumers here. So this is sort of the value chain from the electricity sector. And what has happened in Europe is that generation sector and the retail sector has been liberalized. So as a consumer, you can choose with which retailer you're going to buy electricity. You can just, we have like 20 different retailers. You can choose which kind of retailer you would like to deliver electricity at home. Let's say the same with mobile phone companies. You choose what kind of mobile phone company you want to subscribe. We can, in Europe, we can choose which retailer we are going to buy our electricity or gas from. And then the generation side, that's production of electricity, that also has been liberalized. So you have free entry into this market, and firms can compete in producing electricity. And there's a wholesale market where generators and retailers are going to meet, and they're going to sell electricity between generation and retail. So in order to bring electricity from generation to the households, you need networks. So you need those things that are, you also see here in the street. So we have a high voltage network, that's sort of the big backbone of the network, and then we have a lower voltage network, that's sort of the local distribution network. This part of the sector is regulated. And the EU requires that this part of the sector is sort of put into a separate company. So we don't want that this company here is going to discriminate between certain firms that it has sort of a historical link with, or that are its shareholders. So what the EU requires is that this transmission network operator is independent from the generator, that there are no cross-holdings, that the board of directors is independent, and that this firm is going to be sort of independent regulated company. For distribution company, regulation depends a bit more from country to country, but in principle also distribution network operators should be sufficiently independent. So we have liberalized generation and retail, and then with this part we have changed the type of regulation that was being present. So in the past we had the rate of return regulation, and rate of return regulation basically means a sort of cost plus regulation. So the firm would invest, and you would have the accountants that would look at the books of the firm, and then they would sort of calculate or use a sort of a guaranteed rate of return on capital, and they would calculate what kind of prices this firm would be allowed to charge in the market. So the firm was for sure about the type of revenue it was going to get, and it could always recoup its costs that were invested in the network. So what people now decided is to change this and to go for incentive regulation. So this basically means that you're going to allow the firm to earn some profits if it's going to become more efficient. Yeah, so you want to give some incentives to the firm to improve efficiency. And the way you could do this is, let's say, to fix the price that the firm can charge to consumers, and to allow this price to be fixed for a number of years. So you could have over time, and you would have the price that the firm is allowed to charge. And you could say, I'm going to guarantee the firm that for 5 years you can charge the same price for electricity. So if your costs over time are going to drop, then you're allowed to keep the difference between the price and the cost. Yeah, so if you now are going to lower your costs, you're going to earn some more money, and this is going to give incentives to the firm to be more efficient and to improve operational efficiencies. Yeah, there's now a debate in the literature and also with policymakers whether this system is actually very good in delivering very long-run investments. So some of the assets in the electricity market, they last for 60 or 70 years. And the question now is, does this incentive regulation give the same incentives to the firm to build those big investments? With rate of return regulation, you basically didn't have to worry as a firm because the regulator basically guaranteed that you were going to get, 5% return on your assets. With incentive regulation, there's basically no guarantee. And there are two types of criticism. So the first one is that there's limited commitment power by the regulator. So the regulator is fixing prices for 5 years, but then after 5 years it might learn that the costs have gone down, and it might start to say, okay, next year I want my consumers to be happy because policymakers, politicians, they are unhappy if they see that the company is making a lot of profits, so we're going to lower prices after 5 years. Yeah. And typically in incentive regulation, there's a lot of freedom for the regulator to set new prices every 5 years, or after each regulatory period, the regulators start negotiating and sets a low price. So if this regulatory period is too short, let's say 5 years, and you need to recoup an investment that's going to last for 50 years, then you only have a guaranteed income for 5 years, but the next 45 years you might not earn enough money, and the regulator might say, yeah, those investments are sunk. I'm very happy that you did those investments. Why don't you renegotiate with your shareholders, or the shareholders are going to get a lower interest rate, but I have to listen to the policymakers or to the politicians, and I'm going for a low future price. So the company is going to sort of foresee this because there's sort of an incomplete contract, and the company is not going to invest in the first place because they know there is this commitment problem that the regulator cannot commit to keep prices high. And there's a second criticism to this, and that's basically that the price cap that's being set by the regulator needs to address two different types of goals. And the first one is that you want the price cap to be set in such a way that the firm is going to invest at the right moment. Yeah, so you might have a demand that's increasing, you might have some uncertainty about demand, and you want the firm to invest at the right moment, but you also want the price to be such that the firm is not going to make too much profits. Yeah, so you want a low price cap because that maybe ensures that the consumers don't pay too much, but you also want to have this price cap leading to the right timing of investments. And if you have two goals and only one instrument, then typically that's insufficient. And that's also what Dobbs shows in that paper, that you cannot reach the first best. And then if you look to empirics, I mean, there's basically no empirical evidence. And there are several reasons why we don't have any empirical evidence on those durable investments. And that's because regulation itself is endogenous. Yeah, so if a country is having a shortage of investments, they might change the type of regulation. So if you're going to run a regression on investment levels versus regulation, then the question is regulation the consequence of investment levels, or investment levels caused by regulation? So if you just do a cross-country study, it's going to be very hard to really tell apart what's going to happen. There are some other issues. I mean, you have long asset lives, and politicians, each round of politicians, they want to change the way how they regulate things. So if your investments take a lot of years, but politicians change their opinion every 10 years, how they want to set up the sector, you cannot really get a lot of evidence. And I guess it's also, if you want to do cross-country studies, I mean, I'm not an expert in accounting, but the way how investments in assets are sort of accounted for in different countries is very different. Yes, you have operating costs, those can be compared across countries, but those investment costs, they might be very hard, because some countries, they might have an older network, some countries might have a younger network, so this shows up very differently in the books. And they might also have different types of accounting practices that are imposed by the regulator. So what you could do is to run some experiments. So you could sort of try to simulate the market in a lab experiment and compare different types of regulatory regimes. So, but also there is very, very little work. So I've done one experiment myself, but it's not. I think more can be done on that type of research. So what you can find in the literature is that incentive regulation is going to lead to some productivity gains. Yeah, so the first part that I showed here, that costs are going to go down if you introduce incentive regulation, that's something that we can sort of believe in, because we have some empirical evidence to show that. So notwithstanding that there is no evidence, what we see is that policymakers, they feel a bit unhappy with the price cap regulation, and they're trying to change away from regulation, move away from this price cap regulation. So what you see, for instance, the UK, they were one of the first countries to introduce the price cap regime. They had a whole review of the regulation that was being in place, and then they decided we have to do the price cap, but we have to do something more. So they want to have some incentives for investments. So we are going to impose some quantity targets. So that means that there are explicit incentives for investments, and maybe also want to give some room for experimentation, that we allow the firm to move away from this fixed regime, but they could ask for some exemption from regulation and start experimenting with some of the investments. If you look at the EU regulation or the EU directives, they also impose how we have to regulate this transmission network. Yeah, so this is an agreement that's not made at the national level, but that's an agreement that's made at the European Union level. And the European Union imposes that this transmission network operator has to be an independent firm and that the prices need to be regulated. But now it's going to allow the firm to ask for a regulatory holiday. So they can go to the European Commission and say, we want to do these big investments. We don't want to give, to be under this regime of regulated third-party access, but we want to have an exemption from regulation. And then the EU is sometimes giving them those exemptions. Yes, so there are 30 big energy projects, often, let's say, big new cables, undersea cables, or connectors between different countries, where the EU is basically given a regulatory holiday, where for some limited number of years, let's say 5 years or 10 years, the firm is subject to less stringent regulation than the ones that the EU would normally impose. And the idea is that this will lead to more investments in those big assets. So what's now the goal of this paper? So the goal is to develop a theory model and see, okay, how should we regulate now this kind of firm? So how should the firm expand capacity, and how much of the congestion rent, so how much of the income that the firm is generating should the firm be allowed to keep in order to pay for those investments. And we're going to develop a theory model where we have three different elements in there. So we're going to assume that there's asymmetric information on expansion costs. So this basically means that the regulator doesn't have all the information, but the firm has more information than the regulator. So that's typically many of the modern models of regulation, they assume that the regulator has less information. And here it's about the cost of extending the network. So if you want to build more capacity, you need to incur an expansion cost. And this expansion cost is unknown to the regulator, but the firm knows its own costs. So the second element that we're going to include in the model is that demand is going to be stochastic. So demand might increase or might decrease over time. So that's something that's also the case in practice. And we also assume that investments are going to be irreversible. So once you build a new transmission line, you cannot sort of tear it down and resell it to someone else and hope that you're going to recoup the cost of the investment. So this basically means that we have a real option model. So the real option model sort of models the fact that by waiting more, you learn more about future demand. Yes, so there's a value in waiting and learning about the future. And the third point that we're going to add is a prohibition on subsidies to the network operator. So EU legislation does not allow the government to give subsidies to the transmission network operator, because basically this would mean that one country could subsidize its energy-intensive industry. So here you might have some steel factories, and if you want to give state aid to your steel factories, what you could do is to give subsidies to the transmission network operator. This basically means that the transmission tariffs are going to decrease and that you're subsidizing your industrial users. So the EU
prohibits subsidies on those regulated transmission operators. So what we're going to impose is that it's impossible to give subsidies to this network operator, but you, as a government, you can still tax this network operator. That's sort of the ingredients of the model. So once we have solved for the optimal regulatory model, what we can do is then to see, okay, how can we implement this in practice? And what could be a sort of practical way of implementing this? So what we're going to do is sort of rely on this literature about optimal regulation, and one of those first models is the Baron-Meyerson model. And the Baron-Meyerson model, what you find is, okay, there is information runs to the firm. So the firm has private information, so if you want to use this information as a regulator, then you have to give a reward to the firm in order to, for this firm to reveal its information. And it basically means that there is sort of this trade-off between giving some rents to the firm and sort of how much efficiency you have in the market, because you want to know its costs, and if you know that it's low cost, you can set lower prices, and this is going to be more efficient. Yeah, so this is very similar in this model. So we have some changes. So it's not about production output, but it's going to be about investment. So that's sort of, we have this budget constraint that I just mentioned, and in our objective, we will assume that the regulator values consumers and the network operator in the same way, so that it has the same weight. While in Baron-Meyerson model, the regulator valued consumers more than the regulated firm. And then it's also related to this real option models, but okay. For time, I think I'm going relatively slow, but yeah. So if I have to speed up, let me know. Okay, so what's the model? So we have a demand side and a supply side in the model. So the demand side is basically, we have assumed a very simple constant elastic demand, and we have one parameter, the parameter A, and the parameter A is actually the size of demand. So what could happen, so let's say this is at a certain period in time, we have this type of demand function, and then the A is going to stochastically move over time. And A is going to follow a Brownian geometric motion, so this means that on average there is sort of a growth rate mu at which demand is growing. But there is some stochastic component, so sigma is sort of some variance, so sometimes demand might increase, sometimes demand might decrease, and you have sort of a Brownian motor. So that's demand side. And on supply side, what we basically have is that we have network capacity Q. So this could be a certain level Q. And there is some investment cost C to expand capacity. And the cost of expansion is proportional to how much new capacity you're going to build. So how much you're going to build, so if you build dQ capacity in period T, then the cost of expansion is C times dQt. Yeah, and this in expansion, this could also be stochastic because you're sort of reacting to demand growth. So this dQt is sort of also stochastic parameter in the model. So this investment costs are irreversible, and we assume that there is no marginal cost of transmission. So once you have built the transmission capacity, you can just use it for free up to this level. So this basically means that we have normalized those marginal costs to zero. Otherwise, okay, you can just parameterize the model in a different way. So what's now the objective of the regulator? So the objective of the regulator is to maximize total surplus. Total surplus is sort of discounted, expected discounted consumer surplus minus expected discounted investment costs. But the regulator faces an agency problem, and the agency problem is that it doesn't know C. So if the regulator knows the distribution of C ex ante, and it knows it is distributed on some interval C low, C high. And then there is this budget constraint. So that's sort of the optimization problem that the regulator faces. So now we have to think about how we're going to solve this. And what we're going to do is to rely on a concept in sort of optimal mechanism design, and that's the concept of a direct revelation mechanism. And basically this means that you're going to offer a menu of contracts to the firms, and the menu of contract is going to depend on the type that the firm is going to reveal to the regulator. And the type in our case is the type C. And the contract that we're going to offer to a firm is an investment obligation. So a firm of type C has an investment obligation to invest whenever the level A of demand is going to reach the threshold value A upper bar, and which depends on the investment that were already in place at that moment in time and on the type of the firm. And the second part of the contract that we're going to offer is how much rents the firm of type C is going to be allowed to keep. So in the direct revelation mechanism, you offer this menu of contracts, and then you ask the firm, okay, what's your type? What's your cost C? And then the firm is going to tell us cost C, and then as a regulator, you're going to say, okay, then you're going to take this kind of investment obligation, and this is the rents that you're allowed to keep. Yeah, and direct revelation, truthful revelation mechanism means that we're going to look for a mechanism where the firm is truthfully going to tell its own cost. So we're going to develop an optimal mechanism where we can sort of restrict ourselves to those truthful revealing contracts. Okay, so before we go for the second best solution, where we solve the full contract, we're going first to look at the first best situation, and that's the case where the regulator knows for sure the contract C, the cost C, and that's sort of the benchmark. So we first assume that the regulator knows everything, then we go look for the case where the regulator doesn't know everything, and that we have this asymmetric information. So what we can show is at the first best level that the optimal investment decision, so this optimal investment decision, this investment obligation here, that we can rewrite this, and that this boils down to a price cap regime. Yeah, so for certain investment cost C, expansion cost C, there will be a critical price P upper bar, and whenever the price reaches this P upper bar, the firm should invest in new additional capacity. If the price is below this P upper bar, then the firm should not invest in capacity and should wait until it knows that demand is going to increase over time. So this is what's shown here in the graph. So the red line here is the price level that you see in the market over time. And the blue line is the investment level over time. Yeah, so what you see is that, so the yellow line is the threshold price. So whenever the price is below the threshold price, you're waiting with investments, and your investment levels basically stay the same. Yeah, so at some point, your price is going to reach the threshold level, and then you're going to increase investments in order to make sure that the price is not going to go above the threshold price. Yeah, so you will see that whenever here the price touches the threshold price, you will see some jump in investments here. Yeah, and that's sort of the optimal mechanism, or the optimal contract, in case the regulator knows the cost C of the firm. So what we then need to do is to determine the optimal level of this price cap. And the optimal level of this price cap is going to depend on the cost of expansion. So it's clear that if it's more expensive to invest in new capacity, you should wait longer. So this is going to increase the price cap. Then you have to correct for let's say, the interest rate and the drift. So C is sort of, you incur it once. So you incur the investment cost when you do the investment. The P is sort of a flow variable. So you have sort of some adjustment to do with interest rate. And then you also have a parameter that's sort of reflecting the real option value in the model. So the lambda is a parameter that depends on mu and sigma. So it depends on the drift and the uncertainty in your model, in the demand side. So uncertainty is 0. So if sigma is equal to 0, so it means that the part of demand is sort of perfectly predictable. You don't have a stochastic component. Then this term is going to be equal to 1. This term is going to increase if the volatility of this demand is going to increase. The sigma parameter is increasing, then the lambda here is going to increase, and this term is going to become larger than 1, and it means that we're going to invest later. So that's sort of the classical idea of real option models. If you are in a more uncertain situation, you're going to wait longer to learn more about the future. So that's also what you sort of see reflected in this formula. So what you also see is that in the optimum, the firm, the greenfield investor, is going to make 0 surplus. Yeah, so if you invest according to this rule, then the future expected revenue that you're going to make as a firm is going to be equal to the future expected investment cost. So basically this firm makes 0 profits. Okay, how are we doing with time? 7 more minutes? Okay, so I guess I will skip this part. So now we can look at the optimal program. So it's so basically the program that I described before in words. So we have some objective function, and the objective function is to maximize expected discounted welfare. So we take expectation over all possible demand paths. We have to take expectation over all different types of costs, because the regulator doesn't know what type of firm it's going to face. And then it has to discount future revenue, future welfare, and future welfare consists of gross consumer surplus, and it also consists of the investment or expansion cost, C times EQT. So that's the objective function. Then it also has an incentive constraint, so it wants to make sure that the firm is going to truthfully review its cost C, so it must be the case that the firm has no incentive to lie. And for this we need to make sure that the rents that we leave to the firm, that this is going to satisfy some condition. And this is basically the incentive constraint. So basically this condition requires that the firm is not going to lie. And that basically means that the benefit from lying is that you have some cost advantage compared to a less efficient firm. And this cost advantage is sort of proportional. The value of this cost advantage is proportional to sort of discount investments that this firm should do. And so therefore you have to make sure that you promise some additional rents. Yes, so the amount d pi that you promise is equal to this times dc. And so that's what you promise to the more efficient firm. Then you have the budget constraints. That's sort of new in this model. So basically this means if you promise a firm to receive some revenue, or to receive some rents, that the firm should be able to pay this from the revenue it gets from the market. So this is the market revenue, expected discounted market revenue minus investment cost. This should be larger than the rents that you promise to the firm. Otherwise, you would be giving subsidies to the firm, so you can tax the firm. So it might be that the rents that you give is smaller, but you're not allowed to give subsidies. And then we have the participation constraint, so basically the firm is willing to enter into this contract with the regulator. So we can again do the solution of this model. So we have a stochastic part. We can see that this boils down again to a threshold price as a function of C. Then we can solve this Bellman equation. We get sort of a static Baron-Myerson model. And then we can solve this and solve for the optimal threshold price P. And what we see is that if you look at this threshold price, what we find is that we see again this real option part. So this basically means that the threshold price is higher because we have to wait for information. But then there are two different elements that arrive because we are working in the second best model where the regulator has less information. So the first one is that we're going to I'm just wondering what I wrote down. Yes, so we're going to distort the decisions of the less efficient firms. We go to delay less efficient firms because we want to reduce the rents that we have to leave to the efficient firms. Yeah, so that's what you also find in Baron-Myerson. So you're going to delay firms with high investment costs so that it becomes less interesting for more efficient firms to pretend to be less efficient firms. Now with the budget constraint, what we find is that if you want to give rents to the efficient firm, and you have to do this through the market, so you want to make sure that this very efficient firm is telling you that it's an efficient firm, you have to give profits to the firm, and the only way you can do that is by allowing the firm to earn profits. And in order to do that, you have to delay investments. So you're also going to delay investments for the efficient firms, because that's the only way you can promise them some money. So this is what you see here in the optimum in the model. So here we have the type of the firm C. So that's on the x-axis. And here you have optimal threshold price for the firms. So the yellow line is the first best case. So this is just something proportional to C, and then this is the option factor. So that's the price that you would set if you would know the costs. And then if there would be a monopoly firm, then you basically will have an element that's related to the demand elasticity. So the monopoly firm is going to delay investments and is going to delay it depending on the demand elasticity, because then it's sort of going to get some profit. So it's basically setting sort of marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. And the monopoly firm is going to delay investments according to this blue line. So now if you look at the optimal contract, what we find is that the optimal contract is delayed compared to the competitive case. So it means that the firm will invest later. And it might be even that for very efficient firms that you allow the firm to invest as if it's a monopoly firm, because you want to promise a lot of rent to this firm, and therefore the most rent that you can give to the firm is to allow the firm to act as a monopoly firm. And if there's a lot of uncertainty, then you really want, you end up in this regime where you're going to allow the firm to act as a monopoly. Sort of a laissez-faire regime, we call it. So now how can we implement this in practice? So this direct revelation mechanism where you ask the firm to reveal its cost, that might not be very feasible in practice. So what you can do is to make a contract where there's a taxation on the revenues of a firm, and that the revenue depends on the moment that the firm is going to invest. So you observe at which threshold level the firm is investing, and if the firm is investing late, then you're going to tax the revenues. If the firm is investing early, then you're going not to put any tax on the firm. So basically you need just a taxation of revenues as a function of the investment timing of the firm. Do you have 2 minutes or should we just conclude? Sorry?
3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay. So let's now go back to practice. So if you think back about the electricity market, so how can we now start to implement this in practice? So this level of congestion, this sort of threshold price, might be very difficult to measure in practice because we have sort of a single line model where the firm is sort of expanding capacity along this one transmission line, but in practice we have like hundreds of transmission lines and we don't always observe prices on all those transmission lines. So we could try to look for proxies that are sort of measuring the level of congestion in the network. And in the electricity market, there might be several ways how we can measure those costs. And basically, if you think about the model that we have, so we have some investment level here. That's the price cap that we have here. So we could now think about the rents that the firm is collecting. So this could be sort of the area that we have here. So that could be a measure of congestion in the market. We can also measure what's the value of unserved demand. Yeah, so there's demand for network capacity. Firms are bidding into the market to be able to transport electricity, and you can measure how much euros or how much baht could be generated if there would be more capacity. So you can measure this area, and that's sometimes also used by regulators. And you can also, some countries, they pretend there's no congestion in the market. They have one single price, but then the network operator needs to solve congestion by doing counter trading in the market. So basically by telling someone to increase production and someone else to increase production in order to make sure that no transmission line within the system is congested. And then basically what you do is that the costs of those side deals, that would be another rectangle here. And all those three measures, they are being used by regulators in practice to see how much congestion there is in the market. So within our model, they're all one-to-one related to this optimal price cap. So we could use one of those measures that are being used in practice to implement this type of optimal regulation, where the level of taxation is going to depend on one of those levels of congestion. Okay, so that's if you know. So one of the surprising results of our model is this laissez-faire regime, that we have one part of the firms, or some types of the firms are allowed to invest as if they are a monopoly firm. And what I want to do on this slide is to see when is this going to happen. So this is going to happen when there is a large amount of asymmetric information. So basically this means that the regulator has no clue about the real costs of the firm. So this basically means that the range of possible costs is large. So CH is a lot larger than CL. We are only going to allow this for the most efficient firm. So only if the firm is very efficient and investing very early, then the firm is going to be allowed to recoup or to get all the rents of the market, and we're not going to tax that firm. And we only will have this if the firm has no other existing assets. Because otherwise we could give rents to that firm by allowing it to make some extra profits on some of the other assets that it's owning. And that would be a smaller cost for society. So basically this means that we only are going to allow the firm to keep all the rents, all the profits in the market when it's a very efficient entrant, when it's a very innovative technology. So it means that it's a sector with a lot of uncertainty about the costs of the industry. And it also has to be an entrant, because otherwise, if it would be an existing firm, we could use some of its other assets to promise it some new revenue. So the question is whether this is the case in the electricity market. So I guess most of the time we really know the costs. Let's say it's the transmission network. Maybe for smart networks, if there's a lot of new innovation, then maybe we can see that we should not tax the most efficient firms, and we're really willing to roll out a new technology. Okay, so I'll leave it here, and then yeah. Okay, so I don't know if there are questions or yeah.
Yeah, please. Do you have any questions?
So how many instruments? Sorry, you said that price cap, or price cap is something.
Yeah, so basically what you need is a price cap. So in the perfect information case, you need a price cap and an obligation to invest. So basically if you don't invest according to this price level that was agreed, you will get a huge fine. Yes, so you need both a commitment to invest or sort of a penalty if you don't invest according to a certain rule. So you need two types of instrument there. So that's in the first best case. In the second best case, we have this taxation rule. This taxation rule, but this taxation rule is not sufficient. Yeah, because it could be that some firm says, okay, I'm going to invest very early in the beginning of the regulatory regulation, is saying, yeah, I don't want to be taxed. And then you learn that as demand grows, that suddenly you end up here, and there's a lot of congestion in the network, and the firm is still not investing. What you should then is to sort of ask him to pay taxes on the revenues he got in the past. Yeah, so in that case, you would end up with the right investments, but you sort of have to make sure that the firm that pretended to be efficient then ex-post ends up not investing enough, that you then go back and say, okay, you have to pay taxes on those periods where you didn't pay taxes. So it means you also, yeah.
Also, in European countries like Thailand,
Yeah.
the government tends to subsidize the foreign investment, especially infrastructure investment. So, in the context of your model, how would the result change if we allow government to subsidize?
Yeah, if you allow governments to subsidize, then you basically go back to sort of the Baron-Meyerson model, a stochastic version of that. And then basically you get efficient investments. So basically you will get, for the most efficient firm, so here you have maximum distortion at the top. So the most efficient firm is allowed to invest as a monopoly firm. If you can give subsidies, then what you're going to do is that you're going to oblige this firm to invest as if it's competitive, and then you give side payments to reward for the information. You get minimal distortion at the top. So it's sort of, in our model it flips around. Yeah, so you would get here minimal distortion, and then here you would get some distortion. And I think in this model, because we have assumed that there is no cost of giving subsidies, so then basically you will get a competitive outcome. Because in Baron-Meyerson basically was assumed that the government doesn't like to have firms that make too much profits, and therefore there is some reason why you want to reduce the rents. So if you only change one element in a model, and that would be that you allow for subsidies, then you obtain the competitive outcome. So I don't know if that's sort of the loop Maga mechanism. I don't know if you've heard about that. So before Baron-Meyerson, there's some other mechanism which is called loop Maga, or that are the two outers. And that's basically a system where the regulator doesn't care about leaving rents. Then you give just side payments, you pay their information rents, and you get a competitive outcome. So then you receive the yellow line. If you don't, if you put a lower weight on the revenues of the firm, then you will get competitive, no distortion at the top, and then you get some distortion later on. And then whether it's higher or lower depends on how much you dislike giving rents to the firm. So you will not be able to classify them. But I think what's also interesting, which I don't know how to answer, and that's basically, so the model does not endogenize why we are not allowed to give subsidies. So I give this story, okay, in Europe you could say this is state aid, so that's sort of a simple reason that it's the EU government that's afraid that one country is going to give state aid. But if you see to other sectors, in transportation, the government is allowed to give state aid. So you have the French government giving huge state aid for the railroads, and this is allowed by the EU, but this could also affect the cost of the industry. I mean, if you have industry that relies a lot of railroad transport, you're also giving state subsidies. And the question is, why is electricity different from transportation? And if you look to developing countries, in many developing countries, electricity sector is subsidized. And it's not clear what's different in developing countries or what's different there from the EU case. And it would be nice to have a model where we endogenize, let's say, the behavior of the regulator. Or maybe there could be some corruption, but it's hard to model.
I wonder if in case of energy, whether it's possible or not, if we would combine the investors and the users into one, rather than separate it as the investors and the users. For example, if we talk about energy, it does not have to be a single investment firms that provide electricity for the whole market for electricity, but rather every community which has a demand for electricity might invest in its own. So it will be a different picture. It's not a big scale but small scale. And it will be easier to handle. And so I wonder if the economists has ever thought of that kind of picture. Rather than look at
So I think there are two issues. So one is so you have transmission networks.
Well, for example, if in one community, it would be easy to serve electricity for all households with different techniques of production, rather than serve the whole household of the nation.
So two related things. So one is that consumers, what in some markets happens is that they buy long-term transmission rights. So it basically means that consumers, let's say in the US gas markets, consumers, they might actually sign long-term 20, 30-year contracts for new gas pipelines. And this basically means that they own part of the gas pipeline. And it also means that the regulation of the gas networks in the US is very soft. Because basically they say, okay, there's a greenfield, a new investment, you go and sign up some consumers. Those consumers then negotiate bilaterally some prices. The government is going to look at the contracts, doesn't need to regulate, and then those investments go ahead. So that would be one way of how consumers sort of own by contract some of the networks, and then together with some additional regulation on third-party access, so there's a use it or lose it rule in the US on networks, on the gas networks, and that seems to be working well. So the problem with electricity networks is that electricity networks, the electrons are less easy to guide than the gas molecules. So they follow the Kirchhoff's law, and then it becomes harder to say, okay, you own this transmission line, but the electrons are moving somewhere else. So that's something that's a bit harder. And the other thing that we could think about is sort of to abolish this and to say, okay, we bring generation here into retail, and we start with distributed generation, and we have sort of local production. So there's a lot of people, or a lot of people saying that this could be a good idea, but that we don't yet know where. It's probably going to be a combination of both types of things. So we could have a lot of local production, but we still need some stability of the network. Yeah, and maybe we still want to have some storage, which is going to be, let's say, hydro storage, which is not going to be close by, but maybe we also want to have local storage. And I think this is now one of the big difficulties. That's how we are going to deal here with the distribution company. That's like the company that's having the network in the streets, and that needs to talk to all those retailers, to all those consumers, and sort of make sure that the local network is still remaining stable. And they need to sort of all collaborate locally in order to get this working. And do we need then sort of a local market where all the households in a region are competing with each other, or do we need smart networks or smart meters? Yeah, let's say Google might you might buy some energy services, and then maybe Google is going to run the air conditioning in your house, and you just say, okay, I want some temperature, and you might have some, okay, like how much comfort versus which price. But I think this whole market is not completely thought out yet. So there's a lot of projects going on there.
Okay, second point.
Yeah.
Based on your model, the answer to it lies very much on how capable the regulatory body is.
Yeah.
Do you think that practically the regulatory bodies could be as capable as the investors? You mentioned about the asymmetric information. So in the reality, it seems that government by itself cannot catch up with the private.
Yeah, but that's the whole. I mean, this is the whole idea that we say the firm has more information, so let's use that information. So here we have a model where the firm knows more about investment cost. So my colleague Jasper, he has also looked. Suppose that the firm has better information about demand, then you can also make some similar model. Let's say he knows the growth of demand, and that's private information. So how would that optimal regulation look like? What people are using in Europe is also benchmarking. So basically, that's another way of reducing the asymmetry of information, and that's that they look at all the electricity networks in Europe, that they try to standardize the accounts, and that then compare. Okay, let's say the Dutch network operator, how does it compare to the German network operator, to the Belgian network operator, and then sort of say, okay, seems you're doing worse, and then try to reduce this information. And I guess the third issue could be that the regulator is not sufficiently sophisticated, doesn't have economics to think about it, and I guess that might sometimes be a problem, that the regulator does not really understand themselves how the regulation should work. I guess that's something we should try to improve and teach the regulator how they can move in the right direction.
But at least regulation has won the Nobel Prize.
Sorry?
Regulation has won the Nobel Prize.
Yes, so I didn't mention that. So you have in Toulouse, you have Jean Tirole.
Yes,
and I mentioned here the Baron Meyerson model, but you also have the Lafont-Tirole model, which is about the same time. And there's also an asymmetric information model, but it's slightly different than the one that we're using here. Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm not disagreeing, but I'm kind of curious. You said on the model side, you still have to demand information. Are we regulating a single firm?
Yes. So this firm here.
So we have a single firm. The regulator doesn't know the time.
Yes.
A single firm.
Yes. So maybe I sometimes say the low cost firm, but I mean when the firm has a low cost and when the firm has a high cost. So it's only one firm. Yeah, so here they have a natural monopoly, and they are not. There's no entry is not allowed, and there is some discussion whether we should allow some entry and how we should allow entry, because let's say in the US they don't get any investments here, so they're really worried, and they might want to have merchant investors. And there's also discussion in Europe, let's say between the UK and the Netherlands, they want to build a cable, underwater cable. And maybe there could be an investor that says, okay, I have a nice project, I want to build this transmission line. But this normally would not be allowed under EU legislation. So the US is thinking about allowing investors to invest in new transmission lines, and then also to not to offer all the capacity in the system. So if you build, the monopoly has to offer all capacity that's available. They're not allowed to withhold capacity that they own. But those merchant investors might sort of build something and only use it for 40 or 50%. So that's also sort of a discussion which we don't really have in Europe because, there's still enough capacity. Yeah.
Yes,
to small related question. What is the role of the demand uncertainty in your model? Or in other words, if there is no demand uncertainty, would the result will be qualitatively the same?
Yeah, so the only thing that would disappear is the real option part. So this lambda divided by lambda minus 1 or something, this just becomes 1.
So the investments is still delayed from the adverse selection?
Yes, yeah. So the real option part disappears, and then you have sort of a Baron-Myers model with a small twist to it. So it becomes almost a static problem because you only have this threshold level, and that's sort of a standard. So we have some related literature about delegation. I don't know if you have heard about it. So here we assume that you can not give subsidies, but you can tax. There is some literature where you cannot give any subsidies and no taxes. So no transfers are possible. And that's sort of a delegation game. And then you say, okay, you delegate the decision to someone else, and the only thing that you can decide is sort of the strategy space. You say you can take action 1 or action 2, but I cannot give subsidies. So this is sort of in between full transfers to no transfers. We have here only one-sided transfers.
Another question. In the real world, normally monopolies know more about demand than they do.
Yeah.
As well. For example, they can forecast demand based on good statistics.
Yes, so Gijsbert Zwart and some co-authors from Mannheim, they have worked on this particular model. So they assume that the two stochastic parameters, the mu and the sigma, that they're private information for the firm, and that the regulator doesn't know mu and sigma, but they have a distribution on mu and sigma, and C is known. And then C is known, but then they have some asymmetry of information on these demand parameters. And then they also show they can sort of, with some tricks, get back to sort of a static model, where all the uncertainty is sort of, all the asymmetric information is resolved from the moment you sign the contract. And then, you get all sort of optimal contract. But, okay, I don't know that paper in detail, but yeah.
Okay. Any question from students? I have one question. In Europe, is there any incentive for transmission and distribution network to do a vertical integration?
To integrate? I don't think it's prohibited, but in many member states they're still separated. But I don't think that legally, I think legally they're allowed to do that. I don't really know why there would be, I don't know if there are a lot of economies of scope. What you see is that the boundary has been moving. Yeah, so typically, okay, so the highest voltage level is 300 kV, so 380,000 volts. And then the question is, do you stop here at 36,000 kV, and then here you go to 220 volts? Yeah, so what has happened is that the boundary has been becoming lower and lower. Because, let's say you want to manage the network and you want to make sure that safety is sort of in place everywhere. And some countries, you actually need to know what's happening on the lower level in order to get some safety. So what you see is that the boundary has been moving, but I don't know of cases where there were mergers. What we have seen is mergers across countries. Let's say the Dutch network operators owning part of the German network, the Belgian network operators owning part of the German network, and the Swedish operator. So it seems there are more economies of scale than that there are economies of scope between those levels.
I guess no more questions. Yes or no? Do you want to ask questions? Yes, please.
Your model implies the price cap regulation, right?
Yes, I mean,
So
it's inspired by price cap, and it's okay.
I'm not sure that I have enough knowledge, but I'm wondering if the cost of the firm become very, very uncertainty, such as high cost, very, very high cost, or very, very low cost, how can your model cope with or apply with that situation? For example, we found that the new source of energy, or we face with a kind of the energy shock. So, do this model apply?
Yeah, so if you talk about uncertainty with energy costs, that's basically the demand for transmission. Yeah, so in our model we have uncertain demand for transmission, and demand for transmission is a derived demand which depends on the cost of generation. So that's what the model is about. So let's say you don't know whether wind farm is going to be built or whether you're going to have local production. Let's say you have local, everybody is just locally building some small windmills and doing photovoltaics. Or it could be that it becomes very cheap to do offshore wind farms. So then the demand for transmission is going to be very different. If everybody builds locally, you don't need transmission. If everybody is going to build big offshore wind farms, then you have large demands for transmission. And that's sort of what's here in the model. Uncertainty demand. You could also have uncertainty in the transmission costs, which we didn't model. Yeah, I'm wondering, okay, it might be that if you transform uncertainty in cost, that you could transform this into the uncertainty demand if you're smart, so with rescaling some of the costs, but I have to think about that. Yeah. Thank you.